Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the kind of invitation. I think it's really been not quite what I was expecting on many different ways, I think. And I feel like, honestly, it's been quite overwhelming. I mean, I study U.S.-China relations. I study China and World War II as part of my research, and I teach about these things. But to be in this kind of room and to sort of be staring at some of the images of these warriors and political figures staring back, and all these people with these really deep kind of connections to this history that I've been consulting in the archives or traveling to China and talking to people about, I've found to be really overwhelming. And I think it's really inspirational for me to be around so many people who are deeply familiar with this subject, deeply and in many cases sort of personally familiar. Again, that's been something that's quite moving. I think what I'd like to report, however, in some ways, I hate to be sort of the bearer of bad news, but many students in the United States don't necessarily know this history quite as well as many people in this room. And maybe that's something I don't really need to be divulging, but this is something that I found quite surprising as a teacher of World War II, of modern Chinese history. But the fact is that many students know plenty about the war, right? World War II more generally. They know about the European theaters. They know about the Pacific. They know about kind of battlefield heroism of U.S. soldiers fighting on hard-to-pronounce Pacific islands. What they know little about, I think, is Sino-American cooperation, and that's a shame, I think. I think the problem in many ways is that with only a few exceptions, there are very few U.S. soldiers who are actually engaged on the ground on the Asian mainland. And as a result, many of our students aren't familiar with this history as much as they could be. So I teach a class on China and World War II in Asia, and every year at the end, of course, as a historian of modern China, I emphasize U.S.-China relations, emphasize the importance of Sino-American cooperation and integration in terms of resisting Japan. And at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, I always have students who come up telling me how surprised they are about the depth of this relationship and the importance of China in resisting Japan, fighting against Japan, and ultimately defeating Japan. And this is critically important, I think. I think these students are important. As Professor Kapp was pointing out, what we want is to be able to convey some of the stories that are coming out of many of the people that participated in these battles in Asia, convey them to a new generation. These students in the classroom are really critical. So I'm always really gratified to be able to bring some of these stories about cooperation and to remind people about the centrality of China in the war against Japan. It's not just about the war in the Pacific, right? It's not just about Tarawa, Okinawa, these various battles, important as they were, but it's also about the role of China. I think I'll just make one brief point. I don't want to take up too much time here today. So my research is on kind of Sino-US cooperation, but specifically focuses a lot on Sino-US economic cooperation. And that's something that I haven't really seen. I've been going through the various exhibits, posters, kind of recounting these war stories about World War II and about the war in China, Doolittle Raiders, and other important stories. But I haven't seen much about this kind of economic cooperation. I was planning on talking a little bit more about this, but I'll probably keep it relatively short. But I think that economic cooperation is something that is largely lost in the larger narrative in thinking about U.S.-China relations and thinking about the U.S. and Chinese roles in World War II. I'm not only talking about Lend-Lease, although that's part of it, but I'm talking about all of the Chinese raw materials that were sent to the United States that were used to fuel the American war mobilization campaigns. Goods you've probably never heard of. Tung oil, hog bristles, silk, tea leaves, mica, tungsten, tin, maybe you've heard of. But all of these were really critical in the larger war effort, and they were used in many ways to pay down large-scale American loans to China. Loans that were used to purchase weapons, gasoline, and all of the things that were helping China in its struggle against Japan. Again, this story, I think, the only reason I want to focus on it just very briefly, and I could talk more about it, and I'm happy to talk more about it if people want to in the Q&A after. But this story is one that's largely forgotten, and I'd say it's one that is arguably, more successful. And I think what the larger point that I want to make here, and I'll end with this, is I think it's really critical for us to be excavating these stories of Sino-US cooperation. There's a deep urgency, I think, in highlighting, mutually beneficial policies and highlighting sort of the relationship between U.S. and China in World War II. And I think that this, part of the reason for focusing on these policies is an opportunity to tell new stories about Sino-US relations. And these new stories that don't necessarily just culminate in tension, in conflict. I mean, I think that there's plenty of historical moments in American and China's shared history that do highlight cultural and ideological differences and tension. I mean, there's a growing tendency for our media and for political figures at all sides of the political spectrum to craft historical narratives that focus on tension and seem to lead sort of inevitably to conflict. But I think that, the true sort of digging into the archives, digging into these stories reveals that this is ahistorical and wrong. So I think it's easy to craft a narrative of kind of mutual benefit and cooperation, and to create sort of a new narrative that leads not towards strife, not towards conflict, but rather towards collaboration and mutual benefit. And ultimately, I think that's what we're trying to do. That's what I try to do in the classroom. I think that that's what these kinds of events are seeking to do, is to try to think about new ways of conceptualizing China's past, the US past, and that shared past as a way to think about a possible alternative future that is angling more towards peace as opposed to war and conflict. But I look forward to take your comments and questions after. Thanks.